Good morning, everyone, and welcome to SAR's main membership meeting. I'm Judy Covington, and I'm your president for 2020, and that is such a great honor. This month, we have a great speaker ahead, and I'd like to invite our CEO, Dave Tanner, to lead us on the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you please stand or sit if you have your pajama bottoms on.
Okay, please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay, I said we're going to have a great speaker this morning, and that great speaker is the one and only Gov Hutchinson. He's Vice President and Assistant General Counsel of the California Association of Realtors. Gov has been with CAR since 1985, and he manages CAR's Member Legal Services Program in Los Angeles. Gov advises realtors through the hotline on all aspects of real estate law, and he trains and supervises other hotline attorneys. Gov received his bachelor's degree in history from Princeton University and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. He has written for California Real Estate Magazine, co-authored CAR's continuing education courses, and is a master instructor for the education division of CAR with certification from the California Bureau of Real Estate. He also regularly speaks to association and boards of realtors, affiliated trade associations, city and county bar associations, and major real estate firms. Thank you, Gov, for coming, and take it away.
Oh, you're welcome. I didn't have to come very far, actually. Walked about 3 feet from my bedroom. But anyway, good to be here with you virtually. I wish I was there in person. I can't wait to start doing it again. But anyway, I'm here to update you on the legal stuff that's going on. I'm not just going to talk about COVID-19 stuff, but obviously that'll be the majority of stuff because we're in a new world right now, and it's not going to last forever, but we got to know what's going on right now. And then when I'm finished with that, I'll talk about some of the actual new stuff going on that's got nothing to do with coronavirus, if you can believe it, that there's anything going on other than that, okay? First of all, you may have heard that the governor is going to start to open up the state. But we got to know where we are right now, right? Where we are right now is we're still under a state order that's going to expire soon and then be modified. But it looks like for real estate, it's really not going to change right now. In other words, right now, you're essential. You can do things, obviously, but you have to follow the safe practices and the protocols. And that's not going to change in the near future, you know, with the stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4. In other words, we're not going to have open houses for a while. We're not going to have broker caravans for a while. We're just going to have, you can do real estate, but you got to follow the best practices that are in place now for the foreseeable future. You know what that means. That means showings, one agent and 2 buyers at a time, 2 buyers from the same household. Everybody wears gloves. Everybody wears a mask. Everybody stands 6 feet apart from each other. Everybody doesn't touch anything. Everyone signs a form declaring your basically your health status and your agreement you're going to follow the rules. Sellers are going to promise to disinfect and clean after each showing, whatever that means. Maybe it just means wiping down the doorknob if everyone's wearing gloves and not touching anything. But in other words, these best practices that have been in place for about almost 2 months now are going to continue for the foreseeable future. Not forever, but for now. In other words, how do I know this? Because we sort of got a preview from the governor's office of what's going to be coming on in the next few weeks and months as we gradually open up, okay? The good news is in Sacramento, of course, you can do these things. I mean, it wasn't always that way. In a lot of places in the state, you couldn't do certain things. Now it's getting to the point where pretty much everywhere in the state is very similar on what you can do and can't do. And another thing that just happened, though, is interesting. I don't know if it affects you, is there's state government offices that do title search and recording and notary for real estate can now be staffed. I don't know if you've been having issues with, government offices being shut, like the recorder's office, et cetera, but those can be staffed now if they weren't already. So that's interesting. Let's talk about forms for a second. So we've got these best practices, which I think you're all familiar with, but we sort of embodied these best practices into forms. So if you're using the forms, you're using best practices. So you don't have to worry about what are those best practices again. As long as you do what the forms say, you're good. And that also protects your E&O coverage, because if you're not following the best practices, you're not going to have E&O coverage. And it also protects your liability from your clients. They can't come back later and say, well, I got sick because you didn't do this or that. Well, you give them a form and they sign the form and they say on the form they promise to follow best practices. They assume the risk. They indemnify the realtor if there's any problem. You see why these forms are good. So I'm just you're probably already using these forms, familiar with them, so I won't take much time. I just want to sort of update you on the latest. What forms am I talking about? The first form I'm talking about, of course, is the Coronavirus Listing Addendum, the RLA-CAA, and you can use it for sale listings or lease listings, same form. And on this form, the seller promises to follow the best practices, promises to, clean the house, disinfect after every showing, promises to only let people into the house who are going to follow the safe practices, et cetera, et cetera. They promise to hold you harmless. They also determine right on this form, are they going to allow showings at all? And are they going to allow inspections at all? Because some sellers, even though they're allowed to, have people in the house, they don't want to. They say, I want to do it 100% virtually. I don't want anyone in. And this form sort of explains to them, it's pretty hard to do a house if nobody comes in ever to sell a house. But anyway, I mean, they can, and it tells them that, and there are issues like, what about the realtor? By the way, how can you do a reasonably diligent visual inspection if the seller won't let you in? Well, fortunately, that's not a problem too much, but when it does happen, you can still do that. You can still do an AVID form if you haven't been in the property, and we have available for you on our website. We have these things called quick guides, which are sort of one-page summaries of legal things, and we have a quick guide on showing property in COVID-19, which gives you good language you can put on your AVID form if for some reason the seller is not allowing you to go into the property, okay? There's also some issues where sellers, don't want other people to come into the property. We have another quick guide on that one, sort of contract language to use in other situations. So call the legal hotline, we'll help you with that. But fortunately, that doesn't seem to be too much of an issue, but it can be an issue sometimes. Okay, so hopefully you're all using that RLA-CAA form. The second form you really should be all using is the PEAD, or the Pead, stands for Property Entry Advisory and Declaration. And on that listing addendum, the seller is promising to require that. And remember what I said, if you get people to sign this form, you have legal protection. E&O coverage, indemnification, all the things you need, because everyone is promising to do the right thing. The seller signs one of these forms, the listing agent signs a form. They're both saying they're not sick now as far as they know. They have no symptoms. They haven't been in contact with someone who's sick in the last 14 days as far as they know. And they're allowing showings, and they promise to clean and disinfect. The seller is promising to clean and disinfect. What if you have a listing and the seller's out of town? Now whose job is it to disinfect and clean? Look in the mirror. Unfortunately, it's the listing agent who's got to sort of take that responsibility on if your seller's just not available. In other words, sort of every time someone comes in the property, you got to make sure they give you the PEAD form, and when they're done, make sure somebody wipes down the doorknob and anything else that might have been touched, okay? So the buyer, of course, also signs a PEAD, plus the buyer's agent, plus anyone who's going to enter the property that's listed should be signing and giving one of these forms to the listing agent every single time they enter the property. Now, this form has been tweaked recently. So now, it used to be you'd have to have as a buyer to have a separate PEAD for every address you were entering. Now you can actually use the same PEAD for multiple property addresses. Let's say the buyer's going to go in 3 different properties today. They only need 1 form, but they got to give a copy of that form to each listing agent at each property, okay? And the form is basically dated today. Now, if you're going to go back to that same property tomorrow, you need a new form dated tomorrow. In other words, the reason for this is people's health situations can change on a daily basis. And you're entitled, the seller's entitled to know the current situation. So you sort of each day, buyer's agents, anyone who's going to go into a property should prepare a new PEAD dated today, and then you can use that for multiple properties. On that form now, you can put more than 1 address. Of course, some buyers, you're going to say, I don't want to tell the listing agent all the other properties I'm looking at. I don't want to do that. Well, then you're back to, you sort of need a separate PEAD with just 1 address on it for each showing. And it's, the key thing is you need it for today, right? You need today's PEAD form. Even if you were in the property yesterday, theoretically, something could have changed. So you want to do that. Buyer's agent, you got to give one to the buyer's agent. You can sign the same one if you want to. If you both have the same health situation, there's room at the bottom of the form for multiple people to sign it. Maybe ideally for me, everyone has their own, but that's not actually required. Now, the next question is, does the listing agent have to give a copy of their PEAD to the buyer's side when they enter the property? It doesn't say you have to, but if I'm a buyer's agent, I probably at least want to see the listing agent and the seller's PEAD. And if I want a copy, they should give me a copy, right? So the best practices don't actually require that the listing agent and the seller give their PEAD to everyone who enters the property, but you're certainly entitled to see it, and you're certainly entitled to a copy of it if you want it. On the buyer's side, the best practices are you will actually give a copy to the listing agent each day you enter a property. And this applies to inspectors and appraisers and stagers and everybody, okay? If everyone does this, not only are you minimizing health risks, but you're minimizing legal liability, which is very important, obviously, from my perspective, okay? And of course, on that form, you know what else people are saying? They're saying, I understand that this is not a risk-free situation. You never know. Some people don't know if they're sick. Some people don't want to disclose it or something, and everyone assumes the risk. And they also put on there, they understand it's not the realtor's job to police this stuff. It's not the realtor's job to verify the representations that are made. Because remember, on the buyer's side and the seller's side, when you produce this form, you're saying on the form, as far as I know, I'm not sick, I have no symptoms, and I have not been in contact with someone who's sick. By the way, what if your buyer is like a nurse or something who actually works in a hospital and it's fairly likely they might have had some contact with someone with COVID-19. That's why there's a paragraph 8 on this form where the buyer can actually put down things like, yeah, I'm a nurse in a hospital, so I might have had contact, or I'm a paramedic or whatever, okay? So you can make exceptions to the normal representation. Then is the seller to have to let you in the house? Seller never has to let you in the house. I mean, but the form puts all the things, if you don't let someone in the house, that could affect your ability to sell it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we have one of those forms for sales. We have one of those forms for leases also, the PEAD LR for lease rental. So if you're showing a property to prospective tenants, the same rules apply, okay? Next form, real quick, you're probably familiar with those 2 forms. I think you really need to use every time to be safe. Another form you don't have to use, but we have a form. It's called the CBA, the Coronavirus Addendum. This is the form, if I'm the buyer and you're the seller, we go into escrow and we're thinking, under this COVID-19, maybe things aren't going to go as quickly as normal. Maybe it's going to take longer to get a loan. Maybe it's going to get harder to get a review appraisal, notary delay, inspector delay. So me and you, the buyer and the seller, we can agree up front that if something happens, COVID-19 related, that's going to delay, we can agree up front to an automatic extension, either an automatic extension of the buyer's duty to remove contingencies, or an automatic extension of the ability of the buyer or the seller to close escrow. So you don't have to use this form, but it's a nice form to anticipate these problems. And there's a form that goes along with that called the NUCC, the Notice of Unforeseen Coronavirus Circumstance. That means I'm the buyer, you're the seller. We've signed a purchase contract. We've agreed that if something COVID-19 happens, there's an automatic 30-day extension, let's say. Then we get into escrow, and sure enough, as the buyer, I am having a problem. The loan is taking too long. Inspector appraiser's taking too long, whatever, or I have a health issue in my family, or I got laid off or something. Now I send you the NUCC to notify you, yes, this thing we were anticipating actually happened. So when I deliver you this form, it kicks in the automatic extension. Well, what if after the 30-day extension, I still can't perform? Now what? Well, the contract says if that happens, either the buyer or the seller can cancel the deal. And you can use the CVA to cancel. It qualifies as canceling escrow too. But the next question is, if that happens, does the buyer lose their deposit, or does the seller keep their deposit, assuming the buyer has removed their contingencies? Well, that depends on what box you check on the coronavirus addendum form I'm talking about, the CVA. If you don't check any boxes, the buyer gets their money back. If you check a box, the seller gets the buyer's deposit. I know what you're thinking. The seller says, I don't want to sign that form unless I get their money. And the buyer says, I don't want to sign that form unless I get my deposit back. So they may not agree to this form. This form may not be part of your escrow, which leads to the next question. What if you don't use this form? The buyer's in escrow. The lender is backed up because of COVID-19, so they can't fund on time. The seller says, I'm going to cancel you because you didn't close on time. In that circumstance, is the buyer going to get their deposit back or not? Well, it's going to be up to a court. And you know what? There's a law in California, Civil Code 1511. Some people refer to it as the Act of God clause. And this law actually says, if you're in a contract with someone and something superhuman, supernatural happens, the language is, if there's an irresistible superhuman cause that prevents you from being able to perform your contractual obligations, you can get out of your contractual obligation with no consequence. So the question is, are courts going to treat this pandemic as something that gives people the right to get out of their contractual obligations? Of course, we don't know. And it might depend on exactly what type of contract we're talking about. And it might depend on what happens. I mean, if the buyer gets sick, they'll probably get him out of the deal. If the buyer loses their job, probably. What if the buyer just, because of the environment, they don't want to perform or something like that? Or maybe they're worried about losing their job. There's rumors they're going to lose their job. Or the seller. Is that going to be sufficient grounds to cancel a deal and with no legal consequence? Nobody knows until these start going to court. So all I'm really saying is, to avoid the court analyzing this, we do have a form you can use in the CVA, coronavirus addendum, to sort of anticipate these issues and resolve them up front if you want to. We have one of these for rentals also. Maybe the landlord and the tenant sign a lease, but then something happens COVID-19 related and the tenant can't move in on time, or the landlord can't make the property available on time. Okay, there's a way to, there's a form to deal with that issue. Okay, you don't have to use it, you can if you want. All right, those are the main contractual issues to talk about. Let me talk about a couple other things. Let me talk about rent. By the way, I started this whole talking about the shelter in place, the stay-at-home orders. We have a state one that's going to expire May 15th, and then we're going to transition into phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4. And I also told you that the real estate part is probably not going to change till the end of all this as far as best practices. But if any of you work outside of Sacramento County and you want to know what the rules are there, we have just updated as of today, as of this morning, a chart we have on the website that shows the stay-at-home orders for every county, and some cities within those counties have their own special rules. And remember, these local orders can be stricter than the state order, and some of them are going to last beyond May 15th. Some are not being renewed, some are. In a lot of states, a lot of counties, they match the state, what I've been talking about. Some are still stricter, so you have to be aware of those. We just posted it on our website this morning. Remember, there's a special website for the coronavirus, car.org/coronavirus. And if you go to the homepage of that, on the right-hand side, there's a a tab for a list of local ordinances. You can do that. Which let me transition to my next topic, which is rentals. Any of you guys that are landlords or property managers, you sort of got to keep up with what's going on here too. There's a whole separate set of things that are going on. Let me try to simplify it for you. Number one, there's an eviction moratorium in California. It only goes for one more month, May 31st. What that says is if you're a landlord and your tenant doesn't pay the rent, but the reason they didn't pay is because of a loss of income caused by COVID-19, then you cannot evict them until June 1st for not paying the rent. Not only that, the tenant has to tell you why they didn't pay the rent, and they have to give you proof of that. So that leads to my last two forms, and then I won't talk about any COVID forms anymore. We have a form called the NTAP, the Notice to Tenant about Ability to Pay Rent. Should every landlord send this to every tenant? No. You only send it to the tenants who don't pay the rent. Well, let's say here we are May 5th, right? And I didn't get my rent for May 1st. Well, I could send this form to my tenant and it tells the tenant, I know she didn't pay your rent. If it's COVID-19 related, you need to tell me in writing that's the reason, and also give me some type of backup proof that you lost your job, you got sick or whatever. So the form the tenant has to respond to you is called the RPD, the Rent Payment Delay. And this is the form where the tenant tells me, okay, here's why I didn't pay the rent, because I lost my job. Here's my layoff notice, blah, 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 okay? So, but by the way, you can also use this form to sort of put in a repayment plan. I mean, technically the tenant owes you on June 1st any rent they didn't pay, but sometimes you might want to work it out with a tenant to maybe modify that if you want to. So that's the basic rule, but then it gets more complicated. Believe it or not, as of last count, 142 different cities and counties in California passed their own eviction moratorium. Some of them go beyond May 31st. Some of them tell the tenant, you got 6 months or 12 months to pay back the rent you didn't pay. Remember, the California law doesn't give any time to pay it back. You got to pay it back by June 1st. But I didn't check if Sacramento City or Sacramento County or any other cities around where you might work in have any special rules. We have another chart on our website called the Eviction Moratorium chart, and you can look up your county and your city to see if there is anything specific where you are that sort of modifies this basic eviction moratorium. Where I live in Los Angeles, there are all sorts of modifications. You don't have to pay the back rent for 12 months. It extends past May 31st. And in Los Angeles, there's a rent freeze. Whether you're in rent control or not, no landlord can raise your rent right now in the city of Los Angeles. So I don't know if anywhere you are has anything similar. Feel free to call the legal hotline and we can help you with that. I mean, in some places, what other places have done? They said, well, not only can you not evict someone for COVID-19, in LA, for example, you can't evict someone unless you have just cause. So if someone's on a lease and the lease ends, you have to allow them to stay there unless they did something wrong. All of this is temporary, but you got to deal with it. I mean, you can still give tenants like a 60-day notice. Let's say, unless you have a rule in Sacramento, you can always give a tenant 60-day notice to leave, okay? Okay, because it's not related to COVID-19. There's no special rule you have. Give them a 60-day notice. 60 days from now, they got to leave, right? Well, there's one more thing to tell you. In addition to all of these eviction moratoria, there's the courts of California are closed until August 1st for a lot of different types of lawsuits. And one of the types of lawsuits that they're closed for right now are unlawful detainers. So even after May 31st, when you have the right to evict someone, or even in other cities where you have the right to evict them, maybe in July or something, you're not going to be able to evict until at least August 1st. 3 months from now. And this applies even to commercial properties. And this applies even if the tenant hasn't done anything, even if the tenant has no legitimate reason not to pay the rent. Of course, come August, you can evict them and get all the money that they owe you. But what if right now you're dealing with a situation, I just sold a house, the buyer needs to move in, I want to get the tenant out of there, and they won't leave. I can't get them out till August 1st. That's going to kill the whole sale. You can still tell the tenant, if you don't leave, we're going to hold you financially responsible for any damages you're causing by not leaving. In fact, and that's a type of lawsuit you can still do right now. You can't evict them, but you can sue them for damages. So that might get them out. Or you do the old standby of cash for keys. You bribe them to leave. That still works sometimes. We're already seeing, have you ever had a deal where the seller closes escrow and decides to, and you all agree they can rent back for 3 days, and then the seller won't leave after 3 days? Once again, breach of contract, sue them for damages. What I'd also recommend now that when you do escrows where the seller's going to rent back, use that SIP form, the seller in possession, and put a really big penalty clause there. It says if they don't leave in 3 days, they got to pay, $1,000 a day or something like that. And courts will uphold that. That'll give them incentive to leave as well. Another thing is, I know some landlords now are saying, well, if I just rent to someone right today, all of a sudden they'll move in and not pay rent for 3 months. So maybe what I'll do is I'll make them pay 3 months rent in advance. Is that legal in California? It is and it's not. You can demand rent to be paid in advance, non-refundable, but it's got to be at least 6 months. You can only get 6 months rent at a minimum of 6 months advance rent, not less than that. More than that, yes. Less than that, no. So that's another thing complicating your life. Let me tell you one more complication here. Let's say your landlord, the property that you're renting, residential property, is the landlord who owns that property. That property is, there's a loan against that property, and it's a federally related loan. It's a Fannie or Freddie or FHA or VA loan. There's a nationwide eviction moratorium that lasts till July 25th on those types of rentals. So remember I said the May 31st deadline for the eviction moratorium? That's for most rentals. But if the landlord's property is secured by a federally related loan, forget May 31st, it's actually July 25th. And this applies to any property where the landlord is receiving federal subsidies like Section 8. But of course, you can't evict anyone to August 1st anyway. So July 21st, May 31st, July 25th, what difference does it make? You still can't evict until August the way it stands right now. All right, so that's the latest on that. Related to that, remember what I just said, that there's a special rule for properties that are secured by federally related loans? There's another thing going on, that for these same type of loans, if you're a landlord or you're a property owner, you own a residential property and your property is secured by a federally related loan, meaning a conforming loan, FHA, VA, there's a nationwide foreclosure forbearance. If you can't make your mortgage payment because of COVID-19, and maybe you can't make your mortgage payment because your tenant's not paying you because of COVID-19, you don't have to make your mortgage payment. It's a forbearance. Does that mean you don't owe the money? No, it just means you don't have to pay it right now. How long does that go? Well, that only goes to May 17th. Does that mean on May 17th, if I haven't been making my mortgage payments, that I got to pay it all back on May 18th? No, the lender has to work with you. And basically, if you still have a hardship, they may have to extend you, and they can't make you pay it back all at once in a lump sum balloon payment. They have to structure it so you can pay it back over months or add it to the end of the loan. But the point is, they can't force you to pay it back in full. But that's only loans on secured by residential loans that are federally related. And that ends May 17th. That's when they have to start working with you to structure it. But then, complicating things again, in California, there's a foreclosure moratorium until June 23rd. This is distinct from the May 17th nationwide foreclosure forbearance. Remember, forbearance means you don't have to pay until later. A moratorium only means they can't foreclose on you till June 23rd, but after June 23rd, unless you're one of these federally related loans, they can demand that you pay it back everything you didn't pay. You see what I'm saying? And this, you know, this is our direct loans. You borrow money from Wells Fargo, you borrow money from Citibank, you borrow money from the Sacramento Savings Associate, whatever it is. They can't be foreclosed on if you're not paying until June 23rd, but then they can if you don't pay it back in full. So that's not a forbearance, that's just a moratorium on foreclosures. Those are two different things, easily confused, okay? All right, enough on this stuff. I'm almost done with my COVID-19 stuff. DRE, all of this stuff is actually, you notice it's all delays, right? Things are delayed. Let's say your let's say your license renewal is due on July 1st from the DRE. Well, you can postpone it 60 days. Any deadlines that you have with the DRE between now and July 14th, you can extend for 60 days. Otherwise, but if your deadline is July 20th, it's still July 20th, right? It's only deadlines prior to July 14th. If any of you guys are doing a 1031 exchange, then you know how that works. I got an income property, I want to sell it. I don't want to pay capital gains tax right now. I want to defer it. So I'll exchange it for another property. I can actually do a delayed exchange. I can sell that one first and buy the second one later, but I have 45 days after the sale of the first one to identify the replacement property and 180 days to close it. Well, if you're approaching one of those deadlines, those are extended till July 15th, okay? Last thing real quick, you probably have heard that as of a week ago today, realtors are qualified for something called pandemic unemployment assistance. Even though you're an independent contractor, for the first time in your life, you're actually entitled to unemployment. CAR mailed to you, emailed every single member, a step-by-step guide on how to complete your application to get your unemployment assistance. We know realtors who are already getting money, so it does work. It was totally backed up the first couple days, but you can actually do it now. If you have any questions on the application or questions on can I qualify, not qualify, we have a hotline. We have a special COVID relief hotline, right? 213-351-8450, 213-351-8450, or just go to the car.org website and you'll see it there. If you call that number, we got people there that can help you with your questions regarding getting pandemic unemployment assistance. What if I'm not completely unemployed? I'm making some money, but I'm not making the money I used to make as a realtor. You'll still qualify. I mean, during a week, you get a commission check, right? You're not going to get money for that week. But the point is, you can still qualify for partial funding. And basically, you're going to get $167 per week for the months of February and March, and then $767 a week for April, May, June, July. And after that, back down to a lower number. And you may even qualify for more than that, depending on your situation. The process is actually working now. People are actually starting to get money, or at least get certified. We have Q&As on this on our website, and we also have a hotline that you can call. You can easily get through. The first couple of days it was crazy, but now it's a lot better. You can call that number, 213-351-8450, and get help on that. Don't ask me questions on that, because that's why we have expert attorneys on that hotline who are experts in this. I'm just giving you sort of the big picture, okay? All right. I promised you I was going to talk about things that have nothing to do with COVID-19. So we can talk about something else real quick, just a couple of things. First of all, let's talk about forms. I told you about the 9 COVID-19 forms, and they're all out there. There aren't going to be any more of them. Remember the coronavirus listing addendum, the PEAD for sales, and the PEAD for rentals. the CVA coronavirus addendum for sales and rentals, the notice of unforeseen coronavirus circumstance for sales and rentals, and then those two landlord tenant forms, the NTAP, notice to tenant about ability to pay rent, and the RPD, the rent payment delay. All right, in a month from now, 2 new forms are coming out that have nothing to do with COVID-19. And they're good forms, they're gonna protect you, they're not mandatory, but they're good. One is called the Property Visit and Open House Advisory. It's just advising people that, you know, when you visit a house nowadays, you really don't know if that seller has wired the house to record things and film things and video things. I mean, it does say in the listing agreement that a seller who's listing a house who has recording equipment inside or outside the house should post a notice, post a sign somewhere on the property to tell you that. But some sellers don't do that, or some sellers don't even know the capability of the equipment that they have. So this new form is just an advisory that you would give to everyone entering the property, basically telling them, you know, you never know if this house is wired, you know, so don't think what you're saying is not being recorded. Don't say things to your agent that you don't want the seller to hear at any given time. And also be careful, you know, just in general, you know, houses have steps sometimes that are difficult or terrain that's difficult. And also related to COVID-19, sometimes in this day and age, you're going to be taking off your shoes and wearing booties or something, and they may be more slippery than normal. And anyway, it's just an advisory to the buyer or anyone on the buyer's side, warning them there are risks, just not just recording. There are generally risks when you enter properties, and they're acknowledging the risk and accepting the risk, and they're not going to blame you if they fall down or get recorded and didn't know it, because you've advised them and they signed the form acknowledging and accepting the advice. The second and final new form that's coming out is called the SFLS, stands for Square Footage and Lot Size Advisory. You know there's an age-old problem in real estate. The buyer, of course, wants to know, what's the square footage of this house? And you tell them. Wouldn't it be nice if there was some official square footage, the Office of Square Footage in California, that had the official square footage of every house? There's no such thing. And there's no standard way of measuring square footage. So you could be listing a house and the assessor has one opinion, the appraiser has a different opinion, the other appraiser has another opinion, the seller has an opinion, the builder has an opinion, the architect has an opinion, and the HOA has an opinion. They've all got opinions on the square footage, and they don't agree. So how do you deal with that? Well, we finally have a form that you can give to the buyer, which tells them that. And on this form, you can actually, there's a chart you can fill in what each person thinks the square footage is. And it advises the buyer, you need to check it out for yourself. There's no official square footage. You know, hire your own person, determine what you think the square footage is. Here's what everybody else says. None of these are guaranteed. The realtor's certainly not guaranteeing them. And so you should just deal with that. And basically same thing regarding lot size. It's telling you, don't assume the fence is on the border. Don't assume the bushes and the hedges are on the border. You never know. The only way to know for sure the lot size is to get a surveyor. It's your option to get a survey. We recommend it. But the point is, anything that you hear about lot size is not official unless it is from a surveyor. Plus the boundaries that you may see and look at are not official either unless you do a survey. So I hope this form will hopefully try to kill a lot of lawsuits, because that's a traditional lawsuit against realtors. We've been telling realtors for years, always tell people when you tell them square footage, say, this is I didn't verify this, it's according to this person, and you should verify it yourself. But now at least you have a form to accomplish that officially does that, and you can give it to everybody if you want to. So I think these are two good forms that will be helpful to you. Are there any other forms that we already have that are going to be changing a month from now in June? And the answer is a few. One thing is, remember how it seems like so long ago, but remember we have in California now a new rent control law that says single family homes are exempt. Anything built in the last 15 years is exempt, but otherwise you can only increase someone's rent by 5% plus inflation in any 12-month period, and you can only evict tenants on properties other than single family and new home unless you have just cause, right? So, you may have noticed about 6 months ago that we got these forms like the notice of change in terms of tenancy, or the notice to terminate tenancy, or the notice to cure a default. The Forms Committee decided a few months ago that to put a statement on all these forms that say, you should only be using these forms on properties that are not under rent control. And I think the Forms Committee's thinking was, we don't want you to get in trouble by giving someone a rent increase on a property that's too high on a property. You shouldn't be doing that, or you shouldn't be giving someone an eviction notice because you didn't have, even though you didn't have just cause. So the Forms Committee was being real cautious, and they said, you should only use these forms on properties that are not under rent control. Of course, a lot of you realtors came back and said, well, what form are we supposed to use if we're dealing with property that is under rent control? We need a form to change terms of tenancy. We need to change a form to terminate tenancy. We need a change to deal with, curing a default or things like that. So the Forms Committee went back, and all these forms, you can now use them for all types of rental properties, whether they're covered by rent control or not. There's good disclaimer language on there to try to help you out. I think the Forms Committee just didn't want you to inadvertently get in trouble by giving someone a notice that you weren't supposed to give them. But now at least we have the forms. You can use them just like in the old days for all types of rental properties. I'm talking about the notice of change in terms of tenancy, the notice of termination of tenancy, the notice to perform or cure a covenant, and the and that form. Another thing, the 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. Remember that there's a new law now that says, or that's coming up, that says when you give someone a 3-day notice, you don't count Saturdays and Sundays and holidays. Well, now that's going to be reflected on the form itself, okay? Another thing that's changing, well, that's not changing, this is probably good news for you, is the purchase contract. Some of us, like me, remember the 2-page purchase contract. Some of you remember the 4-page and the 6-page and the 8-page. It's now 10 pages. We know the plan this year was that this form was going to have quite a significant update, reformat, and believe it or not, it was going to turn into a 15-page purchase contract. Well, that's still going to happen, but it's not going to happen until December of 2021. So at least one thing you're not going to have to worry about this year is learning a new purchase contract. Are there any other forms that are changing? Slight change, the cancellation of contract form is going to make it clear that the parties can agree to cancel the contract and still reserve the right to go after the deposit or damages later. Another thing that's happening right now, as you know, effective a few days ago, we got this new clear cooperation rule. So your listing contract is going to be updated to sort of explain that to everybody, that there is a clear cooperation rule, which means if you start marketing a property, you got to put it in the MLS within the next business day, and it defines what does that mean? What does public marketing mean? And of course, there's an exception within your company, and what does that mean? What does it mean that you can still market it within your office? And it basically says you can still disclose it to to anyone in your brokerage, and the people in the brokerage can one-on-one disclose that to their own clients. Anyway, the point is this is now sort of explained on the listing contract, at least it will be in a month, the residential listing agreement, the RLA. And on the form, the seller is basically promising, yeah, if I do any marketing, I will authorize it to be put in the MLS by the next business day. So similarly with that, of course, the seller instruction to exclude listing from the MLS, which is the form the seller has to sign if you're not going to put it right in the MLS, that form has also obviously been modified to take into account the new clear cooperation rule. I guess I should have asked you already, is Sacramento a realtor-owned MLS or a broker-owned? Realtor-owned? So you're under the clear cooperation? Or you're not under clear cooperation? So I never should have said what I just said for Sacramento. Ignore what I just said. Right, Dave? Okay. Anyway, some of you may be may also have listings in MLSs that are under the clear cooperation rule, because remember, any realtor-owned MLS is required to comply with this, as opposed to broker-owned, which I think Dave is telling me is you. But anyway, nevertheless, the form you use, the residential listing agreement, and the SELM are going to have these changes on it, whether it's relevant to your particular MLS or not. So you'll see that in about a month, okay? And then that's really it for new forms that have nothing to do with COVID-19. Are there any new laws coming out there that I need to know about that have nothing to do with COVID-19? And you know, there's just one, and it's not coming out till next year, but just in case you want to think about it, there's going to be a new disclosure form January 1st of 2021 dealing with what's called home hardening. In other words, to protect homes in the event of fires, wildfires, and it's going to be a mandatory form. It hasn't come out yet, but when it does come out, it's going to be a disclosure to the buyer about home hardening. And it's also going to require the seller to disclose to the buyer if the seller is aware that they have any features of their home that make it especially vulnerable to wildfires. And that'll be defined specifically. And then effective, believe it or not, 4 years, 5 years, 4.5 years from now, January 1st, 2025, the seller will actually have to disclose on this form any home hardening retrofits they did and didn't do. For now, you just are going to be providing a form that explains home hardening, and also the seller is actually supposed to be affirmatively disclosing if they're aware of features in the home that make it make it vulnerable to fires, as opposed to home hardening. Also, next year there's going to be it's a whole year from now, I shouldn't even tell you this, but in addition to that, there's going to be another mandatory form. And by the way, this only applies to sellers in fire zones, but there's also going to be a requirement that sellers are going to actually have to provide a statement to the buyer saying that the property is in compliance with, and documentation and proof that it's in compliance with any local or state laws regarding home hardening. So you're going to see one new form January, and then July, a year from now, you're going to see another required representation that the seller has to make. We'll be talking about this a lot more before it happens, but I just wanted you to know that is something that's happening. Here's a new law, kind of interesting. It says if you hire an employee, sometimes employers try to put in an employment agreement with an employee, well, you promise not to sue me for this or this or this. And there's a new law that says you cannot put in an employment agreement that the employee promises not to sue you for a violation of any labor law or fair employment, fair housing law. So even if you tried, I'm not sure none of you would do that, but if you even tried to put it in your employment contract that they waive their rights to sue you for those types of violation, it would be considered unenforceable, okay? Last thing to mention, sometimes people ask, are there any interesting lawsuits that have been happening out there? And there's one that's kind of interesting. Hopefully it'll never be a situation with you, but let's say you got a property, you got a senior lien and a junior lien, right? And you're in default on the senior lien, so the senior forecloses on you. Now what happens to the junior lien? Well, the lien is wiped out. And you know what? Up until now, the junior lien holder couldn't even sue you for damages for the money they didn't get paid. So not only was the lien wiped out, but their right to sue has been wiped out. Well, guess what? The California Supreme Court just changed that. So if you hold a second against someone and the first forecloses and wipes out your lien, you can still sue the borrower now for the money they owe you, even though you can't foreclose on them, but you can actually sue them for damages. That's sort of a big change in the world of secured transactions. So you see, there's not everything in the world that's related to COVID-19, but there's some. Okay, Judy, Dave, do you want me to answer any questions or?
Hi, Gov. This is Kelly. I'm our president-elect this year. We actually do have quite a few questions for you that have come in throughout the presentation, so thank you for that. Dave, did you want to jump in here on something before I start going through questions?
Yeah, I just had one question, Gov. That report that I got this week, where a buyer themselves, or a buyer's broker, they executed the PEAB, both the broker and the two buyers, and the seller had posted notice that they had video cameras. And when the seller came home and looked at their video cameras, they saw the people who had signed the PEAB walking around the house with no face mask, no gloves, no booties, touching surfaces, violating everything that they said they wouldn't do. What's the legal risk there, in your opinion?
I mean, the
We don't have
legal
a case yet, but
Yeah, I mean, that the seller obviously has a lawsuit against those people. I mean, that's misrepresentation, basically. Plus, they're violating the orders, which is also a legal issue. And they're not, you say it was the buyers and the buyer's agent, or just the buyers, or?
buyers and the agent.
Yeah, that buyer's agent has broken the law. So not only might they get sued, but they're not going to have E&O coverage to protect them either, because they broke the law. So this is, yeah, it's a very serious thing. I guess in a perfect world, the seller or the listing agent is actually at the property to try to make sure that people aren't doing this. But yeah, you're still not the police. You don't follow them around every room and see what they're doing. But yeah, that buyer and that buyer's agent definitely have legal responsibility, of course. And now the seller has a responsibility to do a little more cleaning and disinfecting than they would have had if the buyer and buyer's agent were following the rules. So it does, but there's legal liability there for the buyer and the buyer's agent. It's actually criminal liability. They've committed a misdemeanor, not to mention the fact, because that's state law, that they need to follow these practices, not to mention potential lawsuits. So yeah, hopefully it doesn't happen too much. Yeah, that can happen.
Hopefully, if they see this message, it won't happen again.
Yeah, I hope not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Back to Kelly.
Thanks, Kev. Yeah, the first question I have for you is in direct reference to what the lawsuit that you just mentioned about the second lien.
Yeah.
Does that apply in a purchase money second?
Yeah, as far as the ability to sue. Now, what the court said, I must say that this is only going to apply. I mean, in other words, lenders can't get around this by saying, I'm going to lend you some money, but I'm going to divide it into a first and a second. I mean, if the loans are made at the same time, basically they're going to say, you're just trying to get around this. But in the case that happened, they're actually two completely distinct loans at different times. But yeah, purchase money or not, the court seemed to say that this is the new rule, not for a foreclosure, but for a lawsuit for damages.
Wow, that is a big change.
Yep.
Thank you for that update. Going back a little ways regarding some of our coronavirus forms, when we had a question about when we're using the CVA and there is a delay, do we also need to complete an extension in addition?
Well, if you're using the CVA, that tells me that that the parties on that form have agreed to an extension. So they don't need another form to formalize the extension. Of course, what may happen is sometimes even the extension you agreed to on the CVA might get, what happens at the end of that extension if you still can't do it? Well, then you can negotiate a new one if you want to.
Great, thank you. That's appreciated. Regarding the moratorium on foreclosures, does that also mean that they are not allowed to give a notice of default?
Right. Can't give a notice of default either until the deadline. Remember, they were talking about two different things. There's the special rule for federally related loans, and then there's just in general on all loans in California, the foreclosure moratorium. But either way, yes, you're not supposed to start the process at all.
Okay, thank you. So no notice of default during that time frame. Speaking of, can you clarify for one of our attendees what is considered a federally related loan?
Yeah, that would be any loan where there's any federal involvement. It could be obviously an FHA. I mean, some FHA VA, that means government insured or guaranteed. But even service, like a conforming loan that was sold to Fannie or Freddie, and Fannie or Freddie is now the servicer, that is still considered a federally related loan for this purpose.
Thank you. We also had a question about if there were any exceptions regarding new construction for any of these, cancellations or anything related to COVID-19.
I guess what that's asking is, obviously on new construction contracts, you're not using the CAR coronavirus addendum, I suspect. So maybe I'm just being asked the general question is, are courts, based on Civil Code 1511, going to allow people to back out of contracts if the reason they backed out was pandemic related? And as I said, we don't know yet. I think it's going to depend on the circumstances, but I also think it's pretty likely that depending on the circumstances, there are going to be situations where a court's going to say, yes, you can cancel and there's no legal repercussions. But obviously, we don't know this for exactly how it's going to play out. So we're encouraging people to try to anticipate this in your contracts, even your contracts on new construction, to anticipate problems and try to sort of deal with how they're going to be resolved between the parties if they happen. Otherwise, we're going to see how the courts are going to handle these. We've never had a pandemic. We don't know how this is going to shake out in the courts. So we'll see.
Well, we certainly appreciate your experience and expertise, at least in trying to interpret what the courts might do in this case. That's certainly helpful to have that potential projection there. Shifting gears a little bit regarding 1031 exchanges and the delay to the July 15th date. And we have a question about whether that's the close of the escrow 180 days, or is it the designation of the property 45 days?
Yeah, it sort of depends on your situation. By the way, this doesn't apply to new 1031s you initiate now. The point is, if you had already been in a 1031 process, in other words, you'd already sold the initial property, well, then of course you have a 45-day and 180-day. My point was, either one of those deadlines is pushed back to, let's say your 45-day deadline to identify the replacement property is June 1st. Well, now that deadline is pushed back all the way till July 15th. So then your next deadline is going to be, 135 days after that. Whereas if you've already identified the replacement property and your deadline to close the purchase of the replacement property is June 1st, now that's the deadline. So if you haven't even hit that first deadline yet, that deadline is pushed back to July 15th, and the deadline to close would be now pushed back to, 3 months after that. So it depends on where you were in the process when the COVID-19 hit. And it basically hit, for this purpose, it was considered to be in March.
Thank you. As always, it depends, right?
Everything depends.
Let's see, with respect to some of the couple of new forms that you referenced, the buyers, the touring the property, advisory, as well as the square footage advisory.
Right.
First, are those available now in zip forms?
They're not. I think they're available for you to look at on the CAR website, but they still could be tweaked. It's the June release. Very rarely are any changes made in the last month before, but they're not officially out. You can't use them yet. Sometimes we put forms out on the website you can use before they're even on zip form. That's not going to happen with these forms because they're not mandatory forms. So whenever the June forms release happens in June, they'll immediately be on zip form. Until then, no, they're not available.
Thank you. And can you remind us again the name for the square footage advisory you referenced?
Yeah, it's the SFLS, Square Footage and Lot Size Advisory. So SFLS.
Thank you. And we did have a question, Gov, on your thoughts. Would that be something that would be a good idea to have a seller sign when you're listing their home?
I guess, sure. The idea being that Sellers also ask the agent, what's my square footage or something like that. I mean, usually it's the seller telling the buyer what the square footage is. But yeah, sure, it's not a bad idea to have a seller also be getting this form. And you guys know better than I do how the whole square footage works. Does the seller usually ask you as a listing agent, what's my square footage? Or the seller usually think they know what their square footage is? Or, you know better than I do how that, but you're right. If sellers sort of look to you and they ask you what's the square footage, then it would be a good form to give to the seller telling them, well, according to the assessor, it's this, according to the appraiser, it's this. Of course, maybe the appraiser last time it was sold or whatever. Yeah, so it could be useful, yes, to be given to the seller as well.
Thank you. Any requirements as far as having clients sign documents for an initial meeting and or are there requirements to wear protective gear for initial meetings with clients?
About documents for initial meetings, I'm not sure what that would be. I'm not sure what they're referring to. In general, remember I don't know about, I live in LA County. In LA County, when you're supposed to leave the house, you're supposed to have a mask on. But what about if you're meeting someone in a house? Well, there's no law that says you got to do these things. I think we're all going to be conscious of social distancing for a while, but I mean, no, there's no particular laws or anything. If I go to your house and talk to you in your house, or you come to my house, we're probably just going to be naturally careful in this day and age, but there's no particular rules on that or forms on that. Remember, gatherings, you're not supposed to leave your house except to do certain things. Well, real estate is an essential thing you're allowed to do. But I still think it's not a good idea, right, for the buyer to bring their 5 kids and their mother-in-law to that house. You know, you're still probably going to, whether that's considered a showing or a viewing or not, we're all going to use common sense and avoid large gatherings with people we don't live with, I think, for a while. So as opposed to there being specific laws on that, I think we're just all going to be careful and use our best judgment. No particular forms.
Thank you. How about back to the discussion about sellers who have recording devices in their home? Is that something that a seller is required to notify to potential buyers that they have those devices?
Very good question. Legally, no. I mean, I'll tell you right now, I don't have any recording devices in my house, but if I did, and you came to visit me, I don't have to tell you. Now, contractually, the CAR listing contract says if I'm offering my house for sale and I sign the CAR listing, that under that form, I am promising as a seller to put up a sign near the front door or something telling people. But that's a contractual obligation. That's not a legal obligation. Legally, I don't have to tell you anything. Guess what? Sounds like I'm making a joke, but I'm not. I do have to tell you if I have hidden cameras in the bathroom. So you can be entitled to know if you're going and using the bathroom in my house, you're not going to be on camera, right? So that is a requirement. Other than that, it's not a requirement. It's just a contractual thing. So the point is, sellers should be disclosing this, but sometimes they don't, or they don't adequately disclose it. So it's just a good idea to protect everybody. Just give it to the buyer. Just buyer be aware, you know, it's possible. As I said, some sellers don't even know what their devices are capable of doing, and then they find out later, and then all of a sudden they start playing it back. So no law requires it. The listing agreement requires it, and this advisory is not required either.
Thank you so much, Gov. We have just another couple of questions for you before we wrap up. We have a question about what type of a legal risk a seller might be taking on if they aren't allowing a buyer to physically inspect a home.
Yeah, I mean, the legal risk is they're more likely to be accused by the buyer later of hiding a problem. The seller's going to say, I really wasn't aware of that. And the buyer's going to say, I don't believe you. There's no way you could have been living there and not being aware of that. And then they go to court, and whichever one the jury or the judge believes. Whereas if you get an inspection and the inspector doesn't even find the problem, and the buyer says to the seller, you should have told me that. And I said, your own inspector, he's a professional. He didn't find it. So what makes you think I would know about it? So that's sort of the way I think buyers buyer's inspections protect the seller. So that's sort of the risk. I mean, it's perfectly legal to sell a house to a buyer, assuming you can get the loan, without an inspection. There's no law that says you're entitled to an inspection if you're willing to buy it without one. But as a seller, and maybe the seller's going to say, my fear of getting the virus and having any strangers in my house is greater than my fear of getting sued by a buyer accusing me of not disclosing something. You know what I mean? I mean, sellers can make that decision. And if the buyer is willing to go forward with it, then the buyer is willing to go forward with it. But then you'd also have to modify the purchase contract, because the purchase contract gives the buyer a contractual right to do inspections, to do a walkthrough. So the seller if the seller doesn't want that to happen, they'd actually have to do an amendment to the purchase contract, specifying that the buyer is giving up their contractual rights to enter the property. They don't have a legal right to enter, but they certainly have a contractual right that you'd have to deal with contractually. So yeah.
Thank you for answering that. I think that also probably addressed one more question we had there from RE Real Estate Group. So hopefully Gov already covered that for you guys. Lastly, and hopefully this is an easy one for you, Gov, can you talk about which forms people should be using for eviction notices?
You mean just telling the tenant that they want to leave? I mean, we got the same forms. I mean, the forms we've always had. As I said, the only change to those forms is the current version of the form for another month or so has a statement on the form that you should only be using this form if the property is not subject to statewide rent control. You know what I would tell you right now? Go ahead and use it anyway for the next month. I mean, that was just sort of paternalistic advice from the forms committee to try to say, be careful. You probably shouldn't, just trying to tell you, don't even use this form. But then that was kind of a problem, because what form are you supposed to use then? To give someone under rent control a rent increase or something like that. So they rethought that. They realized that was a problem. So what I'm going to tell you is the new forms coming out in June make that clear. But I'm also saying between now and June, go ahead and use the regular notice of termination of tenancy, notice of change in terms. Even though it has that statement on there, you should only use this on properties that are not under rent control. If you have a property under rent control, you can go ahead and use it.
Thank you so much, Gov. We really appreciate you taking on the Q&A here from our attendees. It's very, very helpful.
My pleasure. Well, then I guess I'll say goodbye, right?
Well, not before we thank you again, Gov.
Okay, well, you're very welcome. I can't wait to see you in person one of these days.
If anybody didn't do the math on the introduction, realize this is Gov's 35th year with CAR.
Yes.
Doing this for a long time.
My anniversary is 8 days from today.
Well, we appreciate all you've done for us in that time.
I appreciate all you guys. Thank you.
I've known you that whole 35 years too.
I have known you, Dave.
Thanks, Gov.
All right. My pleasure. See you all later.
Okay,
Outta
off to
here.
risk management.
Yep. See you at 1 o'clock if you want to hear the same speech.
Okay, thanks. Okay, everybody, it's now time for our announcements. SAR's Education Committee reports that our new online platform has received over 3,000 unique views and hundreds of registrations for our free online webinars. The association is pleased to see so many of our members investing in education during this challenging market, and we are most grateful to the generous instructors who have made this valuable education available. We invite you to continue participating in our free live and on-demand webinars. For details of how to get on those webinars, refer to our weekly emails. Our scholarship trustees are hard at work reviewing applications of 61 outstanding school seniors, more than we've ever had. You should have received an email from us this month asking for donations to help these 61 college-bound students with a portion of their expenses. Many of them are now out of part-time jobs on top of missing out on graduation and other senior activities. If you're able, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Scholarship Foundation or purchase a space on our virtual last member standing. And you can contact Madison Hall at mhall@sacrealtor.org for more information. The cost of that, by the way, is $25 per entry. So please help out our scholarship trustees. And at this point, we're going to welcome Aaron Teague, our fabulous, amazing government affairs director, to give us an update. Aaron.
Well, thank you, Judy, and good morning to everyone. I can't see you, but it's good to know that you're all here as we see the little number of participants at the bottom. Just to give everyone an update. So the hot topic is obviously from the county that you are now allowed to show occupied homes. This is something that we were really hard at work trying to put together, everyone from the executive team, myself, Carter, and Dave, and everyone who we could reach out and touch. I know that at times I think some people might have been frustrated with our process, and different pieces were moving, maybe not as quickly as everyone would have liked. I just want to remind everyone that we are hard at work. It has been challenging to do a lot of this work virtually, but we've been making it happen, and we've been connecting with elected officials. One of the things during this time, I think that there's an expectation for elected officials. They normally are expected to be superhuman, and during this time, they're definitely expected to be superhuman, but they also are trying to balance things like their jobs, their role as an elected official, their families, and working in these times of uncertainty. And I definitely want to pass along the message to you that from all of them, they have been very concerned about the housing market and the housing industry, and how will different decisions that they make today impact not only the business of real estate, our local economy, how do we get back up on our feet, and how do we, collectively stay together in this. And so I think that while things may not move as quickly as we would like them to at all times, they are genuinely taking our concerns into consideration and thinking through methodically, how do we put these pieces in place so that it works for everyone? And we will continue to do that and work with them. It's always during these times of struggle and unknown that you remember the people that are there to support you. And so we're not only trying to find ways to support them and what they need, but also make sure that our message to them and how different decisions impact our industry and our business and our affiliates and everyone that surrounds us is an important piece. And so we are definitely working to do that. So one of the things I really just during this time, one of the ways, like, how can our membership be helpful to them and helpful in our message? A lot of them are putting on town halls and Facebook Live and different ways to try to meet their constituencies virtually. And so my suggestion is as much as you can participate in those pieces, please make yourself known and be a part of those conversations, and let them know that we're out there and we're supporting them and that. So, and then I always give the disclaimer, please check, Carter and I are working diligently to make sure with Crystal that the website is up to date, and continue to put information as it becomes relevant up on that. And so that's another piece of things that we can help to keep moving. On the state legislature front, the assembly was back in session yesterday. Masks and social distancing, I'm still not sure how all of those pieces are going to work together, and I'm quite happy that I am not trying to advocate at that level and trying to figure out how to get the ins and outs of all of that for the public record. So that will be an interesting piece to watch. The Senate should be back next week. I think they're still trying to work out. There's been little released on how that will look. One of the most important pieces to kind of mention is, I think I've mentioned this at the last May meeting, but always remind people that really the only thing that the state legislature has to put in place is a state budget, which is something that everyone is going to be very focused on. There's been a little bit of information that the assembly is going to leave it to committees to try to work bills through. The Senate is going to take a more structured approach, which is typical of how both houses move forward at the state level. But the reality is because everyone is going to be so focused on the budget and what funds are going to be needed to A, keep the economy on track, and B, how are we going to respond to this COVID? I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a lot of bills move forward, and then they're going to get to the Appropriations Committee or the Judiciary Committee, and they're just going to die. And by die, I mean they won't get enough votes to actually go before their House. And so we're going to see a lot of things that might make people a little bit nervous, like, oh my gosh, this is moving forward. But I think we're going to just see a lot of things move, and then we'll just kind of disappear. So there's that piece happening. The other piece that talking to John Scribner with CAR, who's the new, I forget exactly what his new title is, but I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with him when I worked in the state legislature. So I think it's a wonderful thing for him to be at CAR now. And he and I had a conversation, and I think he presented to a few of the CAR committees this last week as well. But a lot of this, so the state legislature puts together a budget, and then there's a term called trailer bills, which is kind of what gives the authority to spend the money. And trailer bills are something historically that is this quick, fast moving at midnight pieces of negotiation and trading that happens at the last minute. And typically not everyone always has enough time to read through them. And so the concern right now is, and I was happy to hear John say that CAR is definitely going to be paying attention to this, because I think it will be very important, is that's typically a way where you can kind of sneak in policy things that different legislators want, or that's where the trading for dollars happens. And so to kind of see things might move through that, and that CAR is aware of that, I think is going to be an important piece to how all of this comes together moving forward. AB 828 from Assemblymember Ting has been on kind of high alert. That CAR did a red alert on that, and at this point I haven't heard anything from any update on that. So I've kind of put some feelers out to try to get some more information on that this week, but it is something that we are seeing. And so if you see or hear a red alert come across your email, please make sure to respond to that. And then the other piece that's happening, Carter and myself and some of the just feedback from members, is we're trying to find ways that we can still connect and provide you information while we're all kind of just feeling this out virtually. So we have been working with SMUD board member Heidi Sanborn on putting together some information that SMUD has and incentive programs and how SMUD brings energy and just how to access rebates and information you can provide to your clients. And so that we'll be putting together a sign up for that, but it's going to be on Thursday, May 21st from 12 to 1. We were kind of trying to replace that lunch and learn idea, but renamed it to SAR Keeping You Informed. So you can bring your virtual brown bag with you if you'd like. So look forward to the registration information on that, but it should be really interesting. We had a great conversation with Heidi and some of the SMUD staff on all the different programs. And sometimes it's actually overwhelming how much information they have that's out there. So it's constantly evolving and changing. And so it will be interesting to hear some of those pieces as well. As always, I just give the reminder that please, if you're having any questions or want to follow up on any of these items, to please feel free to reach out to Carter and myself. As much as my coworkers at home are a little bit demanding and they don't pick up after themselves and they suddenly will just erupt for no good reason, we do try to respond to the coworkers and members as quickly as possible. So, and I'm always willing to jump in and respond to that instead of the eruption that's happening in my house. So, as always, thank you.
Thank you, Erin.
Kelly, one other thing that I would like to add on to that, and that is that we anticipate this Friday that the governor is going to make some changes to his regulations and restrictions. Keep in mind that we have both the governor's restrictions statewide, the Sacramento County restrictions for the county. Whichever is the most stringent applies. The governor can't allow you to do something that the county says you can't. The county cannot allow you to do something that the governor says you can't. Now, I don't anticipate Friday there's going to be any significant changes in the real estate industry, but if there are changes there that impact, you have to make sure that you look at the county order, which we have posted all the time. We keep the current one posted on the SAR website. Look at the county order and see, because if the county order has not been changed, the fact that the state order changes does not mean that you can go out and do it. You have to wait until the county says that you can do it. What a lot of counties have done is they just allowed their order to expire, and that way everything's just dependent upon the state order. But that is not the case in Sacramento County. Sacramento County order runs through May 22. So if the governor changes something and it sounds to you like it allows you to do something you've not been able to do, keep in mind that you have to check the county order also and make sure that you're in compliance with that before you get in trouble.
Thank you, Dave. So our next segment is the executive update. Well, guess what? Every last bit of it was covered. Either Gov covered it, or Dave covered it, or Aaron covered it. So I just want to say to the members that took the prior health order seriously, we are glad that you did that. And we're thankful that the county took our request into consideration. Thank you again, Aaron, for all your hard work, as well as Kelly, Aaron Stump, and Denise and Dave. This makes our order consistent with the rest of our region, which is a good thing. And please continue to follow the guidelines required when engaging in any of the viewings. It's for your safety, and it's for the safety of your clients and our clients as well. Don't forget to use the Pead form, and remember that you can use it on multiple properties. That is on the same day. And I want to go back to the stay at home extension. You can view the whole order at saccounty.net. It's on their website. It's right there, right in the front. And if you don't want to read through all of the pages, the definitions and exemptions are on page 10 of 16, and it's under item 12.4 and Roman numeral X, which means 10, of course. So you can view it there. Also, the PUA assistance, that's the EDD website that you need to go to. All of this information is at the CAR website, and it's also on our website as well, the SAR website. So it's edd.ca.gov/unemployment/UI online.htm. And other resources to help with the application. There is a good step-by-step application on the CAR website of how to fill out your application. And that is car.org/en/about-us/news/PUA-APPINS instructions. And then, of course, you have your CAR hotline. And again, the number is 213-351-8450. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending our meeting today. When I looked at the number of participants, there were at one point 186. I'm sure there are fewer now. Our next main meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, June 2nd, and we'll keep you updated on Facebook and on our website. So keep an eye out for both of them. Go out, have a great day, and be safe. Thanks.